Welcome to Lancefield on the Line. I'm privileged to welcome Saiyyidah Zaidi, coach, author, researcher, advocate. You are the founding convener and conversation architect in the Centre for Belonging and Understanding. And obviously got a great gift for titles. Those are fantastic titles. We'll be talking about that. We are both part of the Mailer Campbell coaching community. We're both graduates and you are now part of the teaching faculty. And you admit openly, publicly, that you have too many qualifications and degrees to mention. I won't. Well, I'm not sure you can have too many degrees, but you've had multiple careers. You've been in the past a director in local government and also an architect. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, David. I love listening to your podcast. So for me to be here as a guest is such a privilege.
Well, likewise, and that's very kind of you. Doesn't mean I'm not going to give you a hard time, of course. But anyway, it is called Lancefield on the Line. So we're going to talk about personal identity, inclusion, belonging, progression, and of course, you. So let's get started. Let's talk about personal identity. I mean, many of us have been reflecting on who we are at work and at home, and often somewhat, in terms of a luxury, given we've had our basic needs met. But given the experience through the pandemic, changing work patterns, sort of who are we? What do we want to become? It's been a big topic, at least in the coaching work that I do. What does the concept of identity mean to you?
Gosh, I mean, I think, firstly, what a great question. And I think identity is everything, really. It's about how do you even discover what your truth is, and then how do you lean into that and live it? I think in many ways, identity evolves. So, for example, if I go back to the person that I was in my early 20s, then that's a different form of identity that I had. However, the essence of who I am has not changed. You're a parent, I'm a parent. And I remember when my daughter was born, all of a sudden, my identity kind of then had to encapsulate being a mother. And I had no idea what that really meant at the time. Some days I still don't. But it's just kind of, in some ways it demonstrates that our identity is always evolving and kind of adjusting to the circumstances and the context that we're in.
I agree with that. And how conscious do you think we need to be of our identity? The reason I ask that is that the people I know who've done a lot of work on themselves and have a very clear view of their identity and tell you about it quite openly, publicly. Others don't. And I would guess, I'm making the assumption that they haven't done as much work. But in terms of how they come across and how they express themselves, in my view, do have a clear identity. So how much do you think it matters or about how much work you do on your own identity in order to be yourself?
I think it depends. Some people are comfortable and confident with who they are and don't feel that they need to do the work, but then they may be doing it in other ways. So they may be reflecting on their identity in terms of, dare I even say, TV programs that they watch or radio that they listen to, and use that as a reflection tool for them. In terms of doing the formal work, for example, of coaching or therapy or personal professional development, that I think is important, but it's not necessarily everything in terms of formulating one's identity.
So if somebody, there's some great tips there and suggestions. If somebody came to you and said, in a nutshell, I'm having an identity crisis, or I've got an issue, or indeed maybe there's an opportunity, I think there's something to go for, but it feels quite different to what I've done and who I've been in the past. Apart from perhaps watching a TV program, that would be a good start, or one of their favorites. Where would you start in your work with them on developing a clearer sense of identity?
I think I'm going to draw on one of the times when I shifted my identity in some way. So I practiced or I trained and then just qualified to be an architect, had this life-changing car accident, and I wasn't sure what that would mean in terms of my ability to practice. And so as well as all of the kind of physical ramifications of that, there was also some psychological things to do with who am I as a person, and what was my identity, what are the things that I'm grieving for that I've lost, and where is it that I want to then be in the future. And the beginning of that journey that I went on was really about saying, what do I want to stand for? How do I want to show up in the world? And then unpacking that. And so my first question literally would be around that. How do they see themselves, and maybe even how do they want others to see them? And then using that as the starting point for a series of conversations.
That's very powerful. I appreciate you sharing that story. You talk about conversations there, and many of us have had to relearn how to have a conversation for a number of reasons over the past year, partly because we're working virtually, partly because it's just been really difficult, right? And painful, depending on your situation professionally and personally. But many leaders, I would say, have, if I'm being challenging for a moment about them, they've sort of forgotten the art, the practice of having a conversation. They're very good at broadcast, and they do listen, but often listen to hear what they want to hear, as opposed to engaging in a meaningful conversation. I know that's a topic. I mean, you're a conversation architect, which is beautiful play on your roles and your previous career. What is a great conversation for you?
Such a good question. I would say I think there's three elements to it. And actually, this is kind of picked up in some of the research that I've been doing for my doctorate thesis. So one is deep listening. And that's listening beyond just hearing the words. So, for example, you're listening to the kind of facial movements, to the body language. You're listening for the things that are unsaid. I mean, there's so many different aspects to listening, but beyond superficial listening. And actually, even a good example of that is that when you're speaking with somebody, don't speak to them and look away. Look, have the eye contact, really engage with that person. The second thing is the kind of curation of good questions. It's really easy to ask a lazy question, if I'm allowed to say that. But and sometimes it just requires an extra couple of seconds of thought before the words come out of your mouth.
Yes.
But that small piece of time invested can make the difference between an average conversation and a really high quality one. And then I think the third thing is about the kind of cultivation of that space, and everybody that is involved within a conversation has a responsibility for how that space feels and looks and what it does to the senses. And I think when one is aware of that and actively tries to kind of create a space that is conducive to a good quality conversation, then there's less work to do in terms of then directing it, because it happens naturally.
I really like that. Given conversations are absolutely fundamental to business life, professional life, and given what you said is perfectly possible for people to do and to learn and to practice, what gets in the way?
This is a hard one because I can tell you, I know the theory. I've not always been able to apply it in my life, but the biggest thing that gets in the way of a good quality conversation and even leadership is our individual egos. And when we're aware of that and we're able to put ourselves in a position where we think of the bigger picture and the needs of the particular situation that we're in, then this piece about the ego can sometimes prevent people from doing the right thing. I was in a situation earlier on this week where somebody misinterpreted something that I had said, and other people kind of had corroborated that I'd said what I had, and the intention was sincere and all of those other things. But the problem was that it had been misinterpreted by somebody, and they wanted to kind of not end the friendship, but there was some tension in there that required some working through. And so we spoke again after 6 weeks, a few days ago, and they asked me to unpack what had happened. And I just thought that was so mature of them. So I'm speaking about somebody in their early 20s. And I kind of acknowledged them and first said, thank you for asking such a brilliant question. And then I gave my version of what had happened. And they then gave theirs. And we accepted the situation, agreed to disagree, and move on. Now, and fantastic that we're kind of back to where we were a couple of months ago. The reason I share this as an example is because in many workplaces, people aren't brave enough to unpack what has happened and to have these complex conversations. And then something that happened maybe 5 or 10 years ago is still niggling away in the minds of people, and that impacts performance. And so for me, this thing about conversation is so significant because it can change the trajectory of people's lives.
Absolutely right. I've done the same and shied away from conversations with people who probably were sufficiently different from me in terms of their style and so on, where I'm a bit ashamed to say this, I probably couldn't predict what they would think or what and I would be fearful of the outcome. But every time I did, actually we worked through it in a way that was similar-ish to how you described it, which then gives me a frustration that why didn't I do it on other occasions? Let me just switch gear for a moment, because we've talked about learning throughout this conversation already, learning it from examples like that and your own learning, and I think you said you've said in other places you're in your 5th career. I think that's right. So learning has been part of your life, and that's one of your passions and driving force. What does that term lifelong learning actually mean for you day to day?
That's I like the way that you kind of phrased that question. Day to day, it means that I need some form of intellectual stimulation, and if I don't get that, then, my lived experience is not as enjoyable as it would be otherwise. Now, where does that learning come from? So at the weekend, if I'm going to the cinema with my kids, with my husband to watch a movie, they are slightly embarrassed by the fact that I'm looking at my phone because I have a note that's open to take notes of the things that I'm learning from the movie. So we're having a wonderful experience as a family, but I'm still able to stimulate my own need for learning.
Fascinating.
And of course, there's the really, really obvious things about reading and listening to podcasts and audiobooks and then formal learning as well. But I think every day for me, I have to have something where I can feel as if I'm able to grow through learning some new information.
If you look beyond the day-to-day then to say over the last year, what's the biggest thing that you've learned?
It's a big question. So I think compassion and self-compassion. I'm a very driven, motivated person, which can be both my Achilles heel and my superpower. And often what that can translate as in reality is that I'm not as compassionate to myself as I should be. And I've realized that, I realized it 20 years ago, but I knew. So this is another kind of side note in that we have the information, but we don't necessarily act on it. But I've realized that I have to be much more compassionate with myself.
And without prying into anything particularly personal, I know that term and I understand what it means, but what is that for you? What does that actually sort of manifest itself into?
And so it shows up in things like if I have 30 minutes to spare, then I will go to the coffee shop and I will sit with nothing to do, no emails, nothing to listen to, just watching the world go by. You know, it sounds like such an indulgence and a luxury, and it is, but that's also part of self-care. And that, I think, is a form of compassion that we miss out on because everything is so busy, and as the world is trying to get back into this normal or new normal or however we're going to call the next phase of the world, these pockets of time that we had for rest and recuperation are gone. The more we meet on Zoom, the more we kind of think, oh, well, my meeting's going to end at 11 o'clock. I've got another meeting at 11. I'll be fine. Actually, you won't be fine, because that time that was spent previously in the lifts or on the tube, all of that's missing. So I think perhaps the reason why I'm kind of speaking about compassion is because I need those pockets in order for my brain to be able to kind of close off the previous thing before I go to the next one.
Yeah, it's hard to be always switched on. You can be for a period of time, but then something typically happens. And I think we need to redefine what success means. I mean, so many people define being super busy, madly busy all the time, being successful and positive. I'm on a journey, which means I'm not doing very good at self-care, given homeschooling, looking after a disabled child, and it just shows up occasionally when you don't notice it. You know, a bit more irritable occasionally, not feeling great, and then you have to put it in the diary. And I'm trying to do this as something. Put it in the diary, or use those moments, as you just said, sort of strategically, which is make a choice to do it, as opposed to just, oh, it's the default. I can let it go. I mean, you talked about, please, yeah, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, you said something there really, really important, which is put it in the diary, because I know for me, if I don't have strategic moments of rest, I mean, I say moment, what I'm talking about is an hour, sometimes even a morning or an afternoon.
Yes.
If I don't have those in my diary, then it's very, very easy to get to that stage where you do burn out. So my encouragement to everyone is, as much of a luxury as that sounds, it's really important to do that, because that's an investment that you're having in your business or your coaching practice or your work, or, you know, whatever it is that you choose to do. You just can't keep on going.
Brilliantly put. It's remarkable, isn't it, that elite athletes, musicians, and other fields do what we've been talking about as a norm, because they have to peak at a certain time. And although many of us don't have such peak moments of the race, the concert, and so forth, we still do have our own peaks. Maybe an important meeting, pitch, writing something, doing some research for dissertation, PhD, I should say. You still have to reserve the energy. And I think that's a big shift in mindset in the workplace. Let me shift a bit more about the workplace. You talked about compassion, and we've seen public examples of that, and no doubt our own private experiences. But we've got a long way to go to sustain that as a practice in an environment where many companies are looking to improve representational people from groups that haven't been excluded and involved. And then it sort of shifts to greater inclusion, and then a deeper sense of belonging. And I would argue many corporates have the right intentions, but they're still at first base on representation. So what does the topic of belonging mean to you in the workplace?
Oh, such an important question. And how long do you have? So, very briefly, I would say that belonging begins with a sense of self. So going back to what we were discussing at the beginning in terms of identity, we have to be comfortable within our own skin, you know, and I say that as a non-white person, you know, but actually it's applicable to everybody. We have to be comfortable within the container that we have. And if we're not, then it's very hard to truly have a sense of belonging in any space that you're in. And I think that's really significant to the workplace, because the corporate sector, public sector, everyone is trying to keep their employees at the moment, because now a colleague of mine used the term a war on talent. There's such a need for good quality, capable individuals. And so people, rather than workplaces, now have got more power than they had previously. So if working environments are not able to kind of cultivate a sense of belonging for individuals, people can walk. And that's really quite challenging, given the cost of actually bringing somebody in, recruiting, and then kind of inculcating them into the system and into the workplace. So for me, belonging is not just something to do with inclusion and diversity. Actually, it's for everybody. And this sense of deep belonging that we can create then means that people stay in a workplace for 25, 30 years, regardless of some of the challenges. But when I see, there's cliches about the millennials, but when you look at young people today, they're much more discerning in terms of what their needs are.
Yes, yes.
Yet the workplace sorry, let me think of the right word. The working infrastructure is not able to respond to their needs yet, because the people that are running those systems don't understand this desire for belonging that the young people have. And so we're not seeing it yet, but I can just imagine that there's going to be a huge amount of conflict that starts to happen, because people's expectations are different. So a hiring manager will expect, new trainees to come in and behave in a certain manner, and they're not going to do it anymore.
Mm-hmm. It's still quite an industrial management philosophy of, we run the system, you slot into that little role, that box, and do as you're told and work hard like a production line. So, but if you did have a more open-minded manager who was listening to this conversation, of course, and said, you know what, I need to do a better job. I need to create the space and the conditions where people can feel that deeper sense of belonging. What could she or he do?
I think the first thing is to go on an inquiry to kind of discover what is it that your team, your employees, your workforce want, what will give them that sense of belonging. So I speak in my book, Results, the Art and Science of Getting It Done, about love languages based on the work of Gary Chapman. And when I'm working with individuals and groups in terms of coaching, I always want to know what their love languages are. And it seems really silly that I'm saying this kind of, to your very professional audience, but it's really quite important, because, for example, when somebody gives me a gift, even my poor husband, 99 times out of 100, they get it wrong. And that's just because I'm really picky, and I have no issue in articulating that. But if someone offers me an experience or gives me something to do with time, that's really special, and I pay attention, and I remember gifts that I've had like that. Now, this small piece of information about me actually is really precious. And so for my boss or my people that I'm working with to know that, then can instill a really deep sense of belonging from me to them, because they then know giving Sayyyidah a box of chocolates just doesn't cut it. Do something that's slightly different, and then you have her for life. And if we take this approach and we put that into the workplace, just simply by asking people, for example, what are their love languages, I think things would change. And it's this softer side of things that really has, in my opinion, a direct impact on kind of profitability, on performance, and on long-term retainment of staff.
To do that, you have to have a much deeper sense of curiosity as to the individual you're working with, and to your point earlier, to ask open-ended, incisive questions and then act on it.
Yeah.
Because if you actually broke down the amount of activity that managers engage with, direction, control, supervision, some of that is still needed, of course, but how much of that could be released into what I've just described and what you've eloquently described? But it's a braver conversation, isn't it? It's a much braver. Is it braver? That was my initial reaction, and I thought, actually, perhaps it's not. It's a new conversation. It's something that perhaps you haven't engaged with, or perhaps you sort of think, oh, that's not professional. Whereas absolutely it is, because what you're trying to do is create that sense of belonging and engagement and productivity and so forth. But you can't do that unless you know the individual, enough about the individual.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very courageous conversation, for a leader to come along and say, I want to change the way that things are done, and this is how we're going to have this conversation. It takes guts, and one of the things that I articulate towards the end of the thesis is what can you do to cultivate belonging? So I have a framework of 3 things. One is compassion. We spoke about that enough, and we spoke about conversation. But the third piece is collaboration. And when you've got the combination of these 3, there'll always be an increased sense of belonging.
One question I've used in the context of collaboration, team setting, is asking each other to say, what do I need from you, the rest of the group, to do my best work? That's not the only question you can answer, but actually it's amazing when people say, okay, I'm in this group, not sure quite why, not sure quite what we're here to do. But even if you get over those hoops, you then say, what do I need from? And the answers, if you keep it open, are quite varied, from something specific about a topic, about how they're cared for. But again, it comes down to holding that space in the way you described, to actually talk about what collaboration actually means.
And I would say that it is quite complex and a very kind of innovative way of doing things. So if anyone wants to try it, ask your family if they're interested in this. Because, one of my children is going through their GCSEs, one is doing A-levels, I'm doing my doctorate, and my husband's just started a new job. So can you imagine a team that it consists of these 4 different situations? We have a family meeting once a week, and sometimes in the middle, just to check in terms of what do you need for your next 7 days to be okay.
Fantastic. Is that the question you ask? So you come together and you ask that. Just tell me more. I'm fascinated.
Yeah, so I mean, we run through each day, because my kids are cadets as well, so that brings a whole other dimension and of taxi runs and things like that to it. But we kind of go through the mechanics of the week and discuss who's doing what, and then the question is, what do you need?
So there's a sort of tactical, operational bit, bringing it back to the business lens, but for people who could use a similar format at home or at work. And then there's a deeper thing, which is, how can you help effectively, and what do I need? Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
you mentioned you're incredibly ambitious. You've done amazing things. You're right in the throes at the time of this recording of finalizing your PhD dissertation. What impact do you want to have, and how do you measure your life?
Gosh. So the first question, I think, is easier for me in some ways. When I was growing up, and my mum would say to me, what do you want to do when you grow up? My answer was always to be happy, and I never understood what that meant, but I'm starting to kind of unpack that now. And given the context of some of the work that I'm doing in terms of belonging and understanding, I have a firm belief that if one person feels like they don't belong, then we all don't belong. And what I'm seeking to do now going forwards is really to kind of dedicate my working career to helping to cultivate belonging and understanding within individuals, because by doing that one by one, we then create organizations that are able to really kind of ramp up their sense of belonging. And the more that happens, I think the world will, I mean, it's cliched, but it's true, the world will actually be a much better place. I believe that there's some research that's being done at the moment in terms of exploring the impact of loneliness and suicide, and correlating that with a lack of belonging. And so for me, this is really interesting because that research is going to hopefully corroborate what I've already been thinking, which is when we do cultivate belonging, we actually impact really positively on mental health, on
Yes.
and
Yes.
you know, etc., etc. And so for me, that's really where I want to focus in the future. I think your second question was about impact, wasn't it?
Well, you measure you. It's the same.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of impact and so on. Impact. I said, what would you like your impact to be, and how do you measure your life?
Yeah, so I think measuring my life is really about, you know, these individuals that I can hopefully support or show a way to how they can belong more. And it's hard work, but I think it's really, really worth it.
I think it's. I think you're brilliant, and I think the cause is important. And I think if I wasn't planning on sharing this, but you know, even though I'm a white male in that category, I haven't felt belonging in different circumstances as a father of a disabled child. I feel it every day when we're together, out in the community, not materially, and that brings a sense of loneliness. And working through that in terms of what is your space, who do you feel connected to, is a real journey, and it requires real work. And frankly, you know, some people stay with you, some people don't, some new people come through. But it comes back to the beginning of the conversation around identity. As events happened, you had your accident, we've had, catastrophic brain damage in the case of my son. These events happen, and it reshapes your identity and who and with whom you feel belonging. And it's hard work. It's hard work, and I applaud what you're doing and who you are.
Thank you, David. That means a huge amount. And likewise, I mean, I think, you know, it's very honourable to be so open about the challenges that you're facing as a parent. You know, and I think what you then do, and here's the other thing in terms of cultivating belonging. So you've been a guest on my podcast, and what I do there is essentially create a platform for people to share their stories. And when we listen to individual stories, they may be very, very different experiences from our own, but we filter that through the lens of our own experience. And by doing that, we increase a sense of belonging within ourselves.
Yes, that's it. Yes, because you're not trying to necessarily convince people that thou shalt do X, Y, and Z. And I felt on occasions that I share hopefully skillfully and carefully, with some people can be helpful, and others it creates even more of a distance because they feel uncomfortable or a sense of guilt. But the more that you think it through and talk it through in a way that you feel comfortable, and I feel at the moment comfortable talking about it, it does nurture that feeling of, you know, we're good enough. You know, we have our space. We're creating a new space. We'll get there, as opposed to feeling we don't belong in this community. We're stared at, or whatever the feeling is. And I think people like you who can raise our consciousness of the issue, research it, coach critical people in organizations who will then have a multiplier effect. That's the point, right? Across the organization is something I applaud. Sayyyidah, it's been a wonderful conversation. It's been moving, stimulating, enriching. You are going to continue to have a lot to say, and we need to listen to you and work with you and hear you. Where can people find out more about you and your brilliant work?
Thank you, David. So there's two places. I have my own personal website, which is sayyida.com. And also to find out the work of the Centre for Belonging and Understanding, it's literally www.centreforbelongingandunderstanding.com. And I would love it if anyone listening has any questions about anything that I've said or wants to kind of explore a journey on belonging and understanding themselves. I'm very much at your service.
Wonderful. What a great spirit as well. So that was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. If you've enjoyed the conversation, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel and to the podcast, and do check out the other interviews.